We're going to talk about the plant kingdom in this little mini lecture. So you should already be familiar with the three different domains of life, the domain bacteria, the domain archaea. So those are two domains that consist of prokaryotic organisms. Domain bacteria, we said we're just kind of your run-of-the-mill bacteria, and domain archaea consisted of the extremophiles that lived in extreme environments. And now we're in the domain eukarya that consists of all eukaryotic organisms. And under that domain, we have the protist, which is kind of a grouping of single-celled organisms and some multicellular organisms that are grouped together. And we've kind of discussed how that's an unnatural grouping, but it's more for ease of discussion that we group them all together. And we have the kingdom Plantae now that we're going to talk about. So all plants, kind of true plants. So when we're discussing plants, they are multicellular. So they are organisms that consist of many cells. So we're kind of separating them from any photosynthetic single-celled protists that might be out there. And they are autotrophs. Autotrophs refers to the fact that they are self-feeders. They're able to feed themselves, right? And they do this through the process of photosynthesis. Now you may be thinking, okay, seaweeds and algae, which were protists, were also multicellular autotrophs. So how are they different? And we'll get into some of those differences in a moment, okay? Now, for the most part, most plants are going to be terrestrial, meaning that they live on land. So we find them growing on land. Now, there are some aquatic plants like seagrasses that do live in the water. So don't get completely confused because there are some that you can find growing in the water or at least completely submerged in water. And plants evolved from green algae. So their closest relative is probably that of some type of chlorophyte or a green algal ancestor. And our next slide kind of looks at that. All right, so we've got the algae on the left and we have plants on the right, referring to our terrestrial or land plants. So just giving you an idea of kind of what algae looks like, all right? So completely under the water there, living life under the water, usually anchored to some type of substrate. And we said they're photosynthetic. So we're looking at organisms under the water that are photosynthesizing compared to plants on land that are also photosynthesizing. So typically the terrestrial plant has developed leaves that are out there collecting sunlight. And we've talked about this with photosynthesis. That's kind of the main job of the leaves, is to kind of create a broad surface a lot of times so that they can absorb sunlight through their pigments. And also gas exchange is happening through the stomata that's on the undersides of the leaves and sometimes on the top sides of the leaves as well. Whereas in the algae, basically kind of their whole body is where photosynthesis has taken place. Now, the algae is completely surrounded by water and nutrients that are floating in the water, so all of that is readily available. But for a plant, it has to absorb water from the soil. So they have roots that are growing into the ground that are able to extract water and minerals from the soil. So that's a little bit different. So with plants, we talk about having true organs or true roots, stems, and leaves, which algae does not have. And if algae is growing in the water, it doesn't have to worry about structural support for its tissues. The water kind of keeps it upright, keeps it moving around. A lot of times they'll have like little air bubbles And the air bubbles will help to keep it buoyant, keep their tissues buoyant. If it's living on land, once again, gravity can be a bit of an issue. There's no longer water to support it, so they infuse their cell walls with different structural components. So like lignin is a very thick, tough fiber that's embedded in their cell walls, and that helps to provide support to the plant tissues. Then we also have to worry about drying out. So that's not an issue obviously for the algae, but for the plant living on land, they have to worry about water loss. So they can take up water through the root system, but they can also lose a lot of water through their stomata. So having a waxy cuticle helps to keep in moisture. So it's kind of an additional layer on top of the leaf tissue that prevents water from evaporating out across the tissues of their leaves and their stems. Now, the different groups of plants that we're going to talk about are bryophytes, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. These are just kind of groups that we're talking about, so we're not kind of going by the traditional classification system and the terms that are used for each of these groups. Bryophytes are the first group. Bryophytes are basically mosses. So if you've ever seen a moss, you've seen a bryophyte. So mosses are always very low, tiny plants. They don't get much bigger than an inch tall. So they are very low growing. You find them usually in very moist areas. So the image is showing them growing on a rotted log. A lot of times along creek beds, you'll find them growing on rocks and things. In forest floors, you find the mosses. So very small, tiny plants that grow in very moist environments. So their bodies are comprised of just a few cells. They have very thin bodies, and the reason for that is because they have to absorb water across the surface of their bodies. They have no method or means for absorbing water from the soil. So they have to absorb water across the entire surface of their bodies. So there's no waxy cuticle here or anything like that. They're just taking in water across the whole surface. Now, one of the reasons that they require water is for reproduction. So these plants actually have sperm that have flagella, and the flagella is used to move the sperm through a film of water on the surface of the plant to an egg cell that's located in a little cavity on the surface of the moss. So they actually swim, the sperm swim to the egg cell. So in order to reproduce, they have to have water. So these plants aren't very far removed from their algal ancestors that would also use the water to help distribute their gametes. So we're going to move from mosses to ferns. So ferns have an adaptation that bryophytes do not have. Ferns have developed what we call vascular tissue. So the mosses had to absorb water across the entire surface of their body. Ferns, on the other hand, are able to absorb the water from the soil, like you would normally think of with a plant, and that's due to the fact that they have what's called vascular tissue. So vascular tissue come in two types. One is for transporting water, and that's called the xylem. So the xylem will transport water from the root system all the way up to the top of the plant. So we always say it moves from root to shoot. And then we have phloem, which transports sugar. So sugar a lot of times is being produced in the leaves of the plant. And if it has extra sugar reserves, they tend to be transported down to the root system. So with phloem, we always say it goes from shoot to root. So xylem and phloem are types of tissue, right? So there are different cell types, and the cells are joined kind of end to end to form these long tubes that run through the length of the plant. So from the root system, as we said, all the way through the stems up the plant. And that collectively is called the vascular tissue. So ferns are the first plants that we see that possess this vascular tissue. They also have lignin. So this is a component that's found in their cell walls, and that helps to strengthen their cell walls. So ferns are a lot larger in size than mosses. So ferns get to be about 2 feet tall, let's say, in height. Now, they still require water for reproduction, though. So it's still very essential that they live in very moist environments. So they also require water for their sperm to swim to an egg cell. So they haven't evolved that greatly from the bryophytes in that respect. Now in this image on the right hand on the bottom, it's showing the underside of a fern leaf. So the top picture shows you kind of what a fern looks like, and they get these kind of coiled leaf-like structures that are called fronds, and the coiled area is called a fiddlehead, and you can actually eat the fiddleheads. People fry them up and eat them. And then the undersurface here, sometimes you'll see these little brown specks on them. They're not bugs. I've heard some people think that they had their houseplant or their fern that they had as a houseplant had bugs on it, but these are actually spore cells. So they're kind of a reproductive structure. Oops. Next up, we got a little off-centered here. We have the gymnosperms. There we go. The gymnosperms, there we go, are a lot larger than the ferns. So when you think of pine trees, fir trees, spruces, and larches, these are all gymnosperms, or sometimes they're called evergreens. So they have vascular tissue, just like we saw with the ferns. They also have lignin, just like we saw with the ferns. But what they've done instead is they've gotten rid of that requirement for water for reproduction. So instead they have what we call pollen. And pollen basically are sperm cells. As it says, they're the structure that will contain the sperm cells. So you can kind of think of that in the spring when everything is dusted in that yellow coat of pollen that's in the air everywhere, that's actually the structures that make sperm cells. So pollen is usually spread about by the wind. So instead of needing water to move the sperm cells, now we've got the air that is spreading the sperm cells around. So in gymnosperms, typically you have a female cone and a pollen cone, or a male cone. So the pollen cone, as you see in that image, are usually smaller in size and usually break apart much easily. And so those are the ones that are distributing all that pollen into the air. And then the pollen will land on the female cone, which is the green one that you see there, which usually has a lot of sticky kind of resin-like material on the outside of it that will allow the pollen to stick to it so that the sperm can then fertilize the egg cell that is inside of the cone. So once the egg cell is fertilized, it produces a seed. So in that female cone, the woody cone, a seed is produced, and when the cone opens up, it releases the seed. And you can see the seeds here in the picture. So they have the bottom part where you see kind of the brown oval, that's the seed, and then they have a little wing, kind of papery, filmy wing on it that allows it to be distributed by the wind. So the seed is basically an embryo that is packaged along with a food source that will allow it to germinate and grow until it can start to photosynthesize and make its own food.